His face was a very strong aquiline, with high bridge of the thin nose and peculiarly arched nostrils, with lofty domed forehead, and hair growing scantily around the temples but profusely elsewhere. Created by Dubliner Bram Stoker, Dracula is one of the most instantly recognisable characters of all time.
In 1897, the Dublin-born writer Bram Stoker published the novel Dracula. A one-time resident of Buckingham Street in the North Inner City, and afterwards at the Crescent in Marino. By the time the book came out, he was living in London. This is just a small example of the many thousands, really, of the republications that have appeared over the years. Almost all of these include the image of Dracula we are most familiar with, the long cape. Dracula holds the record as the fictional character who has been adopted more times than any other. Just think of how prevalent this iconic image is in pop culture and how it is used in branding and advertising. And we really are talking about a global phenomenon. Up the top left we see an animated version from the 1960s. Bottom left we see a Lego figure from modern day. And on the right, of course, is Paddy Drac. Paddy Drac was a tallyman, an entertainer, and for 49 years he took part in the annual St. Patrick's Parade in Dublin City, dressed as Dracula. But our vision of Dracula is not the one that was originally presented in Bram Stoker's novel. That image is not what Stoker imagined. But just listen to how he was originally described by Bram Stoker in the novel.
His face was a very strong aquiline, with high bridge of the thin nose and peculiarly arched nostrils, with lofty domed forehead, and hair growing scantily around the temples but profusely elsewhere. His eyebrows were very massive, almost meeting over the nose, and with bushy hair that seemed to curl in its own profusion. The mouth, so far as I could see it under the heavy moustache, was fixed and rather cruel looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. These protruded over the lips, whose remarkable ruddiness showed astonishing vitality in a man of his years. For the rest, his ears were pale, and at the tops extremely pointed. The chin was broad and strong, and the cheeks firm though thin. The general effect was one of extraordinary pallor.
But this is how we generally perceive him now. So how did this change of appearance from the novel come about to the Dracula that we all know and love, or all know and fear? When Dracula was originally written, the other medium for fictional works would have been the theatre, as cinema hadn't been invented yet and the concept of moving pictures was really in its infancy. Bram Stoker was the personal assistant to the great English actor Henry Irving, who operated London's Lyceum Theatre. So concurrent with the launch of the novel, a stage production was held here by Stoker. There was one performance only, essentially a stage reading. This was held only to establish the stage rights for the story. It would be over 2 decades and almost a quarter of a way through the next century before a stage production would again take place. But before that would happen, the first film adaptation would appear. Nosferatu, or Nosferatu, a Symphony of Horror, was a 1922 German production. It's considered a horror masterpiece. Directed by F.W. Marnow and starring the odious Max Schreck as Count Orlok, this was an unofficial adaptation of Dracula. Despite changing the location to Bavaria and not England, and despite significant changes to characters and plot, the similarity was close enough that Bram Stoker's widow, Florence, would successfully sue the makers. All prints of the film were ordered to be destroyed, but thankfully this didn't happen. The portrayal of the vampire is truly horrific, with his rodent-like appearance and strange movements. And here you see what would be the first ever Dracula death scene. Besotted by a woman, the vampire is transfixed by her beauty, stands looking at her and does not realise that the sun is rising, and he is trapped by the rays and fades away. This is a substantial change from the novel, where Dracula is actually killed by a Bowie knife through the heart, and where sunlight weakens him but doesn't kill him in the novel. But there's something in both the novel and this movie and subsequent versions that always bothers me. Why does he always get distracted by a woman? He is immortal, He has plans for an undead world domination, building his own vampire empire, and yet he gets obsessed by a woman every time, and it always proves fatal. I never really understood this flaw in the vampire's ambitions. It would be on the stage where Dracula would next appear, and it would be this production where we would really see the character begin the journey to the iconic figure we know today. Bram Stoker had died in 1912 without seeing any adaptation of his work, and it was left to his widow to safeguard his legacy, as she did in pursuing the makers of Nosferatu. In 1924, an Irish actor, Hamilton Deane, had written a stage adaptation of the novel and acquired the theatrical rights from Florence. It is Hamilton Deane who deserves most credit for reshaping the image of Dracula. Deane was born in New Ross, County Wexford, but his family moved to Clontarf in Dublin, where he grew up, not far from where the Stoker family lived. As an actor, he moved to London, and in 1899, 2 years after the publication of Dracula, he appeared at Henry Irving's Lyceum Theatre. As Bram Stoker was the stage manager here, they would certainly have had a professional relationship at the very least. After many years of success in the United States, Deane returned to London again and had his eyes set on producing Dracula for the stage. He recognised the dramatic potential, but also realised that it needed to be scaled back for the theatre and streamline the narrative and characters into a much more compact format. The most significant change was probably in the presentation of the title's character itself. Deane felt he needed to be presented as a more sophisticated gentleman to allow him to integrate into polite English society, and most importantly, he introduced the iconic evening dress and the iconic cape. Not only did this add to his aristocratic appearance, but it was actually a vital special effects prop. In order to create the illusion that the Count used his supernatural powers to disappear, the actor would wrap the cape around himself, drop through a trapdoor on the stage, and the now empty cape would drop to the floor. The play opened in Derby and would become a massive success, travelling across England and finally to London in 1927. Deane had originally envisioned himself as playing the lead role, but instead cast himself as Van Helsing, the main foe of Dracula, with the role of Dracula falling to this man, Raymond Huntley. He can be seen here on the left in the Dracula role. Some people may recognise him from British television in the 1970s and from two shows in particular, Crown Court and Upstairs Downstairs. The next big step for the play would be to go to the United States. Acquired by a Broadway producer, the script was again altered and characters removed to increase the pace. The big news here was the casting of Bela Lugosi in the leading role. The play opened at the Fulton Theatre in New York in October of 1927 and will continue its New York run for the next 7 months, with 260 performances in all. It would then begin to tour the United States, but when Lugosi bowed out, Raymond Huntley, after years in the role in England, again took over. Though Huntley had played the role for much longer than Lugosi, it was the Hungarian's appearance and his accent that cemented him in people's minds as Dracula. By now the movie industry was huge, and it was only natural that such a hot property as this would be adapted for the screen. Despite his success on stage, Lugosi was not the first choice for the role, but he lobbied hard and accepted a reduced fee to ensure that he got the role. Made by Universal Studios, this was their first horror or supernatural release of the sound era, and would initiate a whole franchise of monster movie characters over the next 2 decades or so. It was directed by Todd Browning, who was a movie veteran by this time, having directed over 50 feature films in a career that had begun in 1915. It seems that this was originally conceived to be a much more lavish production, but the economic crash saw it being scaled back. It was essentially a movie of the stage play rather than the novel, but it would restore some aspects, most notably early scenes set in Transylvania. As well as establishing once and for all the classic image of what Dracula should be, the set design, the whole appearance, the music, etc., it became standard for these types of movies for the foreseeable future. And this is the first appearance of Dracula in the movie when he speaks and welcomes the hapless traveller to his castle. This is Dracula facing his nemesis of the novel, Professor Van Helsing. Van Helsing is played by Edward Van Sloan, who had played the same role opposite Lugosi on stage. This scene shows Van Helsing using a mirror in the cigarette case to confirm that Dracula is a vampire who, of course, casts no reflection. Apparently the actors were disappointed that this scene replaced what they considered to be a much more effective variant in the play, using a large hanging mirror. The movie ends with Van Helsing driving a stake off screen through Dracula's heart, a guaranteed way to kill a vampire. But this Bela Lugosi feature was not the only Dracula movie of 1931. In fact, it was not the only movie made from that script, and it was not the only movie made on those sets, because at the same time and place, a Spanish language production was made by Universal Studios. The reason for this is quite simple. It was a result of a clash between commerce and technology, really. Sound production in movies, the talking pictures, were relatively new. In years past, a silent movie could easily be marketed for overseas audiences with minimal extra costs. But now with the addition of dialogue, this complicated things. There was a large and profitable Latino audience, not just domestically, but also in South America and Spain itself. The sound production technology was developing rapidly, but for now it was more economical to shoot the film twice, the American or English language version and the Spanish language alternative. This wasn't unheard of at the time, and while the Lugosi movie was shot in the studio during the day, a different director and cast would shoot their version overnight. The two versions were based on the same script, but some significant differences ended up on screen. The studio executives overseeing the entire project were mainly concerned with the English language daytime version, and while they were offset at night, the Spanish crew had much more freedom to operate. The Spanish language version is actually a half hour longer than the Lugosi one, and features some additional scenes. One of the differences is that the women wore much more revealing costumes and there are more sexual overtones than the American version. These guys always warrant to mention, I think, when talking about this movie. In Dracula's castle, a couple of armadillos ramble around. This is part of a scene that is kind of setting the odd atmosphere and spookiness of the castle. Why are they there? Probably just to add to the oddness of the film, but it was made in California, so the armadillos were on hand. But certainly you can be sure that neither Bram Stoker nor Hamilton Dean really saw these as part of the character they helped create. It was of course inevitable that once a movie is successful there would be sequels and spin-offs. After Dracula, Universal Studios would continue their monster franchises with Frankenstein, the Mummy, the Wolfman, etc., all of which would spawn sequels. So it was 1936 before this movie here appeared. Dracula's Daughter picks up exactly as the previous movie ends, with police arriving to find Van Helsing just after he has staked a count. Hauled off and charged with murder, he is ultimately freed as the body has disappeared. This has been stolen by Dracula's daughter, who has never previously been mentioned, who burns the body to be free of her father's curse. And Lugosi, or Dracula, never actually appears in the movie, except for, questionably, in this scene where the body is burned, or to be exact, a dummy of Lugosi as Dracula is burned. After the daughter, the next logical relative is the son. Again, never previously mentioned. And again, no Dracula and no Lugosi. Instead, Lon Chaney Jr. plays a Count Alucard who arrives in Louisiana to marry a rich plantation heir with the intention of stealing her wealth. But luckily, a Professor Laszlo arrives from Hungary, so no Van Helsing either, and cleverly spots that the name Alucard is Dracula spelled backwards. He sees through the cunning plan, and young Dracula has his coffin burnt up and as a result gets cut out in the sun. The following year, Daddy was back. In addition to Dracula, the Universal Studio monster movie franchise, which included the Wolfman and Frankenstein, as well as the Invisible Man and the Mummy, in 1944, the House of Frankenstein sold itself on the idea that it featured 5 monsters. Despite the promise of the poster, Dracula doesn't even meet the Frankenstein monster in the Wolfman in this movie. In fact, he's barely in it at all. So this is how we first see him, on display in a sideshow, staked out in his coffin for everyone to gawk at. A bigger surprise awaits, not just for the hapless fools who are going to pull that stake out, but also for the audience. The removal of the stake revives Dracula, but it's John Carradine. It's not even the much missed Bela Lugosi. His supernatural return isn't too impressive either, to be honest. He is sent off by the Mad Doctor to kill somebody, but doesn't get back to his coffin on time and is killed by the rising morning sun. So the following year, the 5 monsters are back. By what supernatural means has Dracula revived this time? Who knows? The scriptwriters obviously didn't care enough to even try and explain, so he just turns up. And if that wasn't bad enough, despite the title of the movie, it's not even his house. The Mad Doctor, in this case, has a reputation for unusual practices. It's his home, actually. And both the Wolfman and Dracula turn up seeking a cure for their curse. But he changes his mind about the cure, decides to vampirize the attractive young nurse instead. And every time he crosses paths with a woman, his plan goes wrong. And his coffin is dragged outdoors for the 2nd movie in a row. He is killed by the rays of the sun. Once again, Dracula is played by John Carradine, not Lugosi, and as you can see, he retains the classic image and he adds in the top hat, which is more his thing than Lugosi's really. By the late 1940s, after years of declining quality of the movies and also due to changing tastes over the war years, the monster movies were waning in popularity. But what better way to continue than by pairing them up with the popular comedy duo Bud Abbott and Lou Costello for another all-star monster mash. And despite studio expectations, it was a success, ensuring that over the coming years the comedy team would face off against all kinds of monsters in their movie career. Lugosi plays Dracula 17 years after the first classic movie, and it's a worthy performance. One of the strengths of the movie is that the monster characters all play their roles straight, while the comedy duo do all the hamming up. On the movie screen, this was only Lugosi's 2nd appearance as Dracula, and his final one. So it's incredible to think that while the vision of Bela and his distinct cape and pose is how we largely imagine Dracula to be, this status was achieved with only 2 movies. But I suppose that's not the full story, so let's just jump back in time a little bit. Even before Dracula had come out in 1931, it is claimed that Lugosi had enough of the role. He is even quoted as saying, "No, not at any price. When I'm through with this picture, I hope to never hear of Dracula again. I cannot stand it. I do not intend that it shall possess me." It seems he already had a fear of being typecast, and while he knew the role would be the making of his career, he saw it as a springboard to better things. That was not to be. Other roles eluded him outside the horror or monster genre, and while he may not have played Dracula more than twice, he was doomed to play variations of the character. So this is the first one. Here's a wonderfully atmospheric publicity shot, and can anyone say with a clear conscience that that is not Dracula we're looking at? Well, according to the movie, it's not. It's Count Mora, who along with his daughter, seen on the left, is suspected of vampiric murders in a small town. This Dracula wannabe is not the only dishonesty about the movie, as in fact it turns out they're not even vampires. They're actually actors playing a role to help expose a real non-supernatural murder plot. And if you think the cinema-going audience felt cheated by this reveal, imagine how the actors felt. They played their roles in the movie believing they were portraying vampires and only found out the plot twist in the last few days of shooting. Apparently they were quite annoyed, particularly Lugosi, who argued strongly with the director, Todd Browning. Made by Columbia Pictures, they had originally intended this to be a direct sequel to the 1931 Dracula movie, but Universal Studios threatened legal action, and instead of Return of Dracula, we got Return of the Vampire. Essentially for Lugosi, this was again Dracula by any other name. This time he was called Tesla. Made in 1944, this fairly cleverly makes use of the World War II background. It's set in London during the Blitz. An air raid bomb disturbs the final resting place of a staked-out vampire, not Dracula remember, who was soon up and about and terrorising the citizens. But as the Nazis give it, the Nazis take it away, and during another air raid attack, the vampire's lair is bombed and he is trapped outside in the sun. And in 1952, Lugosi doesn't even warrant the fake Dracula name. In this he is just called the Vampire. The plot involves a robot purchased by the vampire, which gets delivered to old Mother Riley instead, a washerwoman character played by Arthur Lucan, who starred in a whole bunch of these movies. Sadly for Lugosi, these latter years were difficult as he struggled with a dwindling career and drug addiction. This comedy would have been an unworthy ending to his Dracula-style roles, but one last embarrassment was yet to come. But before I move on to that, I just want to take a look at two separate returns of Dracula to the stage, which feature some of those who originally made it famous. In 1939, the Irishman behind the first successful adaptation was responsible for its revival on the London stage. And this time, Hamilton Dean, seen here on the right, himself took the leading role as the vampire, with one reviewer noting that he was suave and sinister in the most polished way, and one does not feel easy until he is put out of the way with a stake through his heart. So, starting out in the Winter Garden Theatre in Drury Lane for a month, the production would transfer to the Lyceum for a couple of weeks. Now, this is quite significant because the Lyceum was the theatre of the great Henry Irving, where Stoker had spent many years as stage manager, and where Stoker's own production had taken place in 1897. It was due to be demolished soon, so this was an appropriate swan song, and after one performance, Bela Lugosi, who was in England at the time shooting the movie, appeared on stage with Hamilton Dean. Lugosi himself would have two more runs on stage as Dracula in the United States in the 1940s, and in a final disappointing attempt to headline in London's West End in 1951. In an interview in 1943, Lugosi expresses his enthusiasm performing to a live audience. He says, "It will be a real thrill to hear an audience gasp in terror. The more horrified they are, the better I like it." With his career in serious decline, Lugosi arrived in England in 1951 with the aim of a short tour that would culminate in a West End engagement. After he arrived, the weeks dragged on. He had shows in Brighton, Eastbourne, Glasgow, Belfast, Manchester, Middlesbrough, Leicester, Chatham, Cambridge, Chiswick, Luton, and so on and so on. But the promised land of the West End was never getting any nearer. Lugosi was now 68 years old, and his morphine addiction was increasingly a problem, and his stage performance began to suffer. So eventually, with more travel ahead of him, but with no West End production in sight, he told his producer, "I can't go on, it's taking too much out of me. Please finish this quickly." And the remainder of the tour was cancelled. Lugosi stayed long enough to film his role in the old Mother Riley movie and returned to the States. And sadly, the remainder of his career was destined to consist of low budget and poor quality movies. In 1959, Ed Wood Jr. had released Plan 9 from Outer Space. Footage of Lugosi had been filmed by Ed Wood a few years earlier, with Lugosi rambling through a graveyard and outside a house, wearing a costume from one of his stage productions. There was no script to go with this footage at the time, and Lugosi died before there would be one. So Ed Wood, when he eventually had something on paper to work from, simply used the footage of the clearly identifiable Lugosi on the left, and filmed new scenes with a different performer, which you can see on the right, who is noticeably taller and plays the part with the cape obscuring the obvious fact that he is not Lugosi. And to add insult to injury, in the final completed version of the script he is listed as the Dracula character, but that doesn't even make it to the screen credits. It's a sad end to a career that created such an iconic look and something that is still with us. Lugosi himself had passed away in 1956 of a heart attack. He was buried in California, and quite appropriately he was wearing a distinct Dracula cape. But the distinct image of Dracula he's synonymous with would, like the Count, become immortal. It's now almost 90 years after the movie version first appeared. It's almost a century after Hamilton Dean created the stage version, and over 120 years since Bram Stoker's novel. And it's Lugosi's unmistakable vision we all share of Dracula. And it's all thanks to two Irishmen and a Hungarian. I'm just going to take a whirlwind tour of the years since Lugosi's death and see how this iconic image of Dracula has survived and expanded. Billy the Kid meets Dracula. There was also a Jesse James meets Frankenstein's daughter by the same director. John Carradine has the distinctive look, and as you can see on the right, he also has the top hat. While film buffs associate the Universal Studios with the birth of the horror franchise characters, it was this studio that would reimagine, re-energise and continue that legacy, with their own versions of the Frankenstein monster, the Mummy, the Wolfman and of course Dracula. Now, the Hammer movies were really the second wave for these characters, and what differentiated them from earlier versions were Technicolor, of course, but also changing standards meant that they could be much more explicit in terms of violence and blood. They could feature more sexual themes and could feature more nudity, or at the very least, more revealing attire for the women on screen. This series would kick off with Dracula in 1958, which was essentially another retelling of the novel, but again with elements of the novel changed and trimmed down. The role was taken by Christopher Lee, another iconic figure of Dracula. He stands almost 6.5 foot tall. The British actor was once told he was too tall to get leading roles in movies. I think for generations of moviegoers, the question always was, who was Dracula? Was it Lugosi or was it Lee? But the important thing is, if it wasn't for Lugosi, there wouldn't have been a Lee. So, like the 1931 movie, this one was a massive success and it gave birth to many sequels and spin-offs. Lee would appear in the role many times, dying in increasingly imaginative ways in each one, only to be revived in increasingly imaginative ways too, and increasingly ridiculous, to be honest. But Lee would play the Count 10 times in his long career, as well as the Frankenstein monster, the Mummy, and maybe for younger viewers, he's probably better known for his roles in Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. One thing about the Hammer franchise, it was quick to change with the times and chase a modern audience. I like this poster that has the slogan, "Drink a pint of blood a day," which was based on a milk advertisement at the time to drink a pint of milk a day by the Dairy Council. Dracula AD 1972, I think the title says it all. The time, now. The place, King's Road, Chelsea, very hip. And if you look at the one on the right, the top makes it even clearer what to expect. The Count is back with an eye for London's hot pants and a taste for everything. In the 1970s, black magic, witchcraft, Satanism, etc. were really topical, partly with shock horror stories about the real dangers, partly by hippies who I think enjoyed the dancing naked aspect of the rituals, and it became popular in horror fiction. Of course, Dracula would have to cross paths with some satanic forces. With a ticket purchasing audience increasingly lapping these movies up, it was also inevitable that the potential to cross over into other genres would be considered. Christopher Lee, who considered himself a serious actor, would increasingly question the silliness and quality of the scripts. But even when he backed away, there was always somebody ready to step into that cape. Kung Fu movies sell tickets, Dracula movies sell tickets, so what could go wrong in combining them? Either way, Christopher Lee was gone. But as you can see, the tall, collared cape was back and the iconic image was there. In the 1970s, having recognised that black audiences would flock to see movies with black characters and dealing with issues faced by African Americans, a whole new genre was born, blaxploitation. While mostly leading to action or crime movies, we also had movies like Blackenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Black, and this one. This is a pretty good movie and does include commentary on historic slavery and modern day 1970s racism and poverty. It wasn't only the movies that recognised a need to incorporate more black characters at this time. Around this time, Marvel Comics started publishing a Dracula comic book, very much in the traditional style as you can see on the left. And in issue 10, the character of Blade was introduced, a jive-talking ghetto boys vampire hunter who of course decades later would feature in his own franchise, starring Wesley Snipes. And then if there's young children in the room, maybe cover their eyes for a minute or two. This one, I think, it doesn't really need any explanation, does it? No, however, that for the moment anyway, in the poster, Dracula is wearing the standard Dracula costume. And I think we should be grateful for that. From 1975, it's the first sign language horror feature. But if you look at the still on the right, you can see the vampire signing his threat to a victim. And again, just remembering that this is a family show, I will only briefly mention the whole other subgenre, that of the sexy vampire that emerged in the 1970s. This is a Hammer movie. This is Ingrid Pitt in Countess Dracula. The story is actually based on the historical figure of Count Elizabeth Bathory, who in the 14th century bathed in human blood to stay young. And if you think things can't get any other, there's this. There's a lot I could say about that movie, but for now I'll just say enjoy the oddness of looking at the image of the dog sitting up with a shroud around him in a coffin, and maybe next year I'll have an opportunity to do a talk on vampire animals. Zoltan was neither the first or the last, you might be surprised to hear. While Bela Lugosi was not the first actor to play Dracula, many more have followed in his wake in movies from every part of the world. To the best of my knowledge, David Niven is the only actor to have played both Count Dracula and James Bond, two of the most iconic fictional characters of all time. Beyond the movies, the TV shows, the comic books, etc., Dracula is a cultural icon, so enduring that he can be seen as a nice pop. There he is as a vegetarian duck from a cartoon series in the 80s. There he is as a chocolate-coated breakfast cereal. And there he is as grandpa to a family of monsters. And importantly, an honorary mention must go to Patrick Bergin. The Irish actor was a guest of the Big Screen Festival last year to talk about his role as Dracula in a 2002 Italian TV version. And as you can see from the still, his image, while in the movie he does have some of the trappings of the Lugosi Dracula, it's much closer to what his fellow Dubliner Bram Stoker really envisioned. But Patrick Bergin is not just an Irish actor, he's a Dublin actor. And that brings us right back really to where it all began. Bram Stoker is often described as living in Marino or Clontarf, and his time in Trinity College is often mentioned. But it should never be ignored that he lived in Dublin's north inner city, at number 17 Buckingham Street, for 6 years of his life. I think it was from the age of 7 to the age of 13, which an impressionable age where he could soak up the atmosphere, the occurrences and the superstitions of the surrounding area. And they are, as my colleague Hugo McGuinness has greatly illustrated, they feed very much into the imagination that created Count Dracula. And here are two brilliant pieces of artwork that commemorate the fact that Stoker lived in the north inner city. These remind us every day that one of fiction's most enduring creations has strong associations with our community. And yes, the classic image of Dracula may diverge from the original conception, but no doubt Bram Stoker would be proud to see his character becoming immortal, as indeed he always was, until he met a woman. With that said, I'm going to wrap up. I want to thank the Big Scream Northeast Inner City Halloween Festival for giving me this opportunity to present the talk. I think it's also important to congratulate the Big Scream Festival particularly on the 2020 festival, because it's been a very difficult year for people all over the world. We all need as much diversion, as we possibly can find. So they've achieved a lot under very difficult circumstances. And I just want to send out a special thanks to Andy Brooks of the Bela Lugosi blog. Go and check it out online. It's a fascinating archive. It's well worth checking out for every aspect of Bela Lugosi's life and career. And it's from that blog, the Bela Lugosi blog, where I sourced the theatrical material and images of the various stage performers I used. So that's me done. Thanks to everyone who's watched. Enjoy the rest of the spookiest day of the year. And hopefully maybe next year I can do this face to face in the Big Screen Festival. So thank you and goodbye.